Hello, welcome to State of Sustainability. Just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to run through some sustainability corporate market insights, discussing why it's been the biggest month on record for the release of corporate sustainability reports. We're going to talk about the delay of the CSDDD and what this means for business. And also we're going to talk about the farmer engagement program launch frenzy that has been hitting headlines every day for the last few weeks. After that, we're going to run through a bit of a topic spotlight and talk through supplier engagement programs and what we've seen work and not work. So let's get to it. Seth, hey.
Hey Z, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm jealous that you've had 3 coffees, been to the gym and have had your day start already, whereas I've slightly rolled out of bed feeling blurry-eyed.
That's fine. This is A/B testing, Izzy, so we'll see which format works better.
And just for context, listeners, Seth's actually in Kenya, which means he's 3 hours ahead, not he's just super proactive in the morning.
Yeah, excited to have a head start on you, Izzy. Excited for the content. We have a lot of great stuff to discuss. And yeah, I'm glad I had a few hours warm up here.
Yeah. And how is everything in Kenya?
Yeah, good. It's actually 28 degrees, which is nice. So I'm kind of watching everyone in their sweaters and jackets, and sort of not feeling very empathetic, I guess. Sympathetic, but not empathetic. And obviously much more sunlight, which is nice as well. I've started to realize that I really hate the winter atmosphere in London. Like, I kind of like the build up to winter, but I really hate the grayness, the dampness. I love London in many ways, but London gets really soggy. And in the dismal dark of winter, that sogginess just seeps into your bones. So that's what I'm not missing.
Well, I'm looking forward to pulling you back to Wales next week for our company offsite, just to give you that dose of rain.
Thanks, Izzy.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's dive into the market insights. So as you said, this week has been the biggest week for corporate sustainability reports, with some pretty big ones being released from Starbucks, Heineken, Walmart, McCain's, Nestle, to name a few. I feel like there are lots more on top of that. A few key themes that we've been seeing is that there's been a big emphasis on the operational emissions reductions. So a lot of progress in lowering GHG emissions versus baselines. This has basically been down to big moves to renewables. So Nestle, we've seen an 84% cut in their operation emissions from sourcing their electricity from a different spot. Another key area is the focus on packaging. So a lot less virgin materials being used and investing into alternative materials, as well as improving waste management. This has been quite a popular focus, and Seth would love to get your take on this, because packaging is the most valuable marketing real estate. I think it's at the top of many companies' agendas. And then finally, a lot of focus in the synergies between nutritional data and sustainability data. So a big push for like alternative materials. So we were at an event the other day where Fraser did no cocoa chocolate, which was slightly radical. But Nestle also looking into, sugar-reduced milk. But we are seeing that to account for these on an emission front, you need a lot better data granularity. Seth, what are your thoughts on those key themes?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack here, Izzy. So let me sort of go one by one and just remind me if I'm missing anything from the rundown. Yeah, but I kind of want to start with Nestle and the renewable energy theme. So renewable energy as an emissions reduction lever is kind of a tale as old as time. It's not actually special anymore in many cases. And let me give you a few examples. I've worked with a number of textile manufacturers in emerging markets, for instance, and most of them have already started to achieve 30, 40, 50% reductions in scope 2, mostly by just bringing their grid power onto their facility and onto their site and setting up their own solar installations. Some of them are these sort of classic Asian business conglomerates and have actually gone into energy as a business area in its own right. So the renewable energy shift is not hugely special, even in emerging markets, let alone in Europe, where In Europe right now, you almost have cost parity depending on where you are and what type of use case you're deploying. What I think is special is, again, on the emerging markets front, once you start to move out of the aggregated kind of third-party manufacturer zone into smaller suppliers, then the renewable energy transition starts to get really difficult. Nestle is a huge global organization, and the fact that they're making these kind of inroads into their energy use and into the energy transition at that kind of scale means that they're already moving likely beyond just the third-party manufacturers, that textile example I'm giving, moving beyond the third-party manufacturers and into smaller suppliers. And once you start to get into that space, you actually start to run up against just grid transition issues in emerging markets. And so I'm kind of intrigued over time to dig into just how Nestle is going to keep momentum going there without actually just a large-scale transition of grid power in emerging markets, which is hugely complicated. The other thing that I always find interesting about Nestle is that Nestle tends to double down on the core capabilities. And one of the core capabilities that I see for Nestle is that Nestle tends to sort of go into a specific raw material sector and try and really dominate it by creating a great kind of mutual value proposition for suppliers. So when they work with, let's say, dairy, they want to actually go in and be the best friend of the dairy industry and work with the dairy industry and give value-added services and support. They do the same thing with coffee. Let me give you two examples, for instance. On the dairy side, I grew up in Pakistan, and when I was a kid in Pakistan, the dairy industry was hugely fragmented and had huge issues around quality, but also wastage. Most of the milk went bad within a few days because there was no way to keep it cold. And Nestle entered that market around about when I was kind of an early teen, or hopefully a bit earlier even, not to date myself. But Nestle went into that market, and Nestle's initial offering was to set up chillers on the farm site. So wherever there was a small dairy farmer or a cluster of dairy farmers, Nestle would actually kind of bring in chillers and say, look, here you can keep the milk cool and chilled. And by the way, we'll buy everything that comes out of this as well. And that helped Nestle very quickly build up a pretty dominant position in the Pakistani dairy industry, where I think anecdotal benchmarks at some point were that Nestle had like a 50% market share in the local dairy industry. That might be inflated or it might even be understated, but that was what was going around. The other area that I'm finding interesting, which is more recent, is what Nestle is doing in the insurance space in the coffee industry, for instance. And we should talk about this at some point, but as you know, Izzy, my own farming business was decimated because of climate risk events and the inability of the business to get insurance coverage to cover the cost of those climate risks. What Nestle has been doing recently is moving into releasing its own kind of sponsored or backed insurance efforts to insure coffee farmers, I think starting in Southeast Asia, against climate risk events. That's, again, a great kind of value proposition to the farmers to really double down on building a relationship between Nestle and the suppliers, and also actually dovetails nicely with a sustainability strategy. So to just come back to the renewable energy question, what I think is going to be interesting to watch with Nestle in this space is how does Nestle actually lean in and actually create almost a unique ecosystem advantage or a unique partnership model to use the renewable energy transition as a way to get closer to suppliers and build, again, a tighter relationship, even more of a lock-in. This is, I think, like a nice win for the planet, but also a really big win potentially for Nestle. So that's one quick set of observations there. So maybe going to packaging, I'm noticing a few interesting movements in the packaging space, and I think that it's going to take a few years for all of this to settle. So with energy, we know what the sort of the one-hit wonder or the sort of the silver bullet is. The silver bullet is basically renewable energy transition, and whatever one says about like hydrogen and alternative fuels, etc. Really, we're talking about an electrification agenda, and it's about how quickly can we kind of promote electrification and how quickly can we convert electricity to renewables across the world. Happy to debate that, and Greg Jackson at Octopus is probably a better debater on this topic than I am, but let's put that to one side for a moment. In the packaging space, we have yet to see that sort of silver bullet emerging, but there are a couple of different candidates. And I think that there are likely to be three, let's say two different candidates and one sort of dark horse. I think that the two mainstream candidates vying for supremacy right now in the battle of the substrates. And for anyone who's not familiar with the terminology, like just, you think of different packaging materials as different packaging substrates. And so the battle of the substrates, which is a fierce war of attrition happening right now across packaging industry players, is basically do you back plastic as a packaging material? Do you back pulp and paper? So think of like Tetra Pak and cartons. Do you back glass? Do you back metals like aluminum and steel? But these are basically the four big candidates. And right now there's a lot of uncertainty, not just around which one will win, but even around which one is actually more sustainable. And that's actually like a uniquely weird situation in the sustainability space, because most sustainability professionals intellectually feel like they know what the right answer is. The problem with the battle of the substrates is that actually on an emissions basis, probably durable PET is either number one or number two if you just look at emissions. And that's something that, again, just ideologically most sustainability professionals hate, because we've all grown up being anti-plastic. And the reason we're anti-plastic is we're anti-plastic because plastic is a very visible form of waste. Plastic ends up in the ocean very frequently, depending on market, ends up in the ocean and takes thousands of years to degrade, if that. When it degrades, it's actually probably worse, because it ends up being kind of all kinds of sort of microplastic particles ending up in the ecosystem and in the biome. And so we all basically hate plastic. At the same time, if you look at the actual emissions of plastic per unit, it's remarkably low. And one of the reasons for that is that plastic has become so versatile as a packaging material that you can basically, if you think of your plastic mineral water bottle, which is again anathema to many of us in this space, if you think of your mineral water bottle, there's probably about a thimbleful of plastic making that bottle. The actual amount of plastic going into that is super, super, super low and getting lower pretty much every year. If you actually start shifting that and say, let's go towards durable PET, something that you can actually reuse again and again, potentially like you're going down to really small fractions of the emissions of any comparable material for that purpose.
So you're saying that packaging then is less about the material, but more about the operations around it. So like the collection, the logistics, the waste treatment.
It's both. It's both. So reuse and probability of recycling rather than recyclability, and let's go into that in a moment, but will radically change the emissions profile, certainly, of any packaging material, like radically. Depending on how many turns you can get, and by number of turns, I mean, let's say it's reuse, depending on how many times it can be reused, or let's say it's recycling, depending on how many times you can actually reuse that material without it just kind of degrading and being downcycled, you can radically reduce the emissions profile of the material. That said, if you remove reuse and recycling from the equation, there are very clear leaders and clear losers in the substrate material. So for instance, glass ends up being one of the worst in a pure single-use world because it's super emissions intensive. Making glass requires huge amounts of natural gas, and it's very difficult to actually replace that natural gas with anything else, any more sustainable material. In the metals process, the upstream process of kind of smelting and everything that happens before the molding is again hugely energy intensive. A lot of that is coal-based, and so both of those materials on a single-use basis look radically worse than plastic and pulp and paper. On a reuse basis, they start to look a lot better because with both plastic and pulp and paper, you can actually not recycle them endlessly. So with pulp and paper, the more you recycle it, eventually actually a share of the pulp and paper just basically kind of disappears from a material standpoint. Like you can't just take a cardboard box and keep turning it into a new cardboard box without adding new pulp and paper components to it. Whereas a glass bottle, you could potentially just keep using that, and your glass bottle, the actual material in it could just be reused virtually endlessly. And a lot of the same dynamic holds true for metal packaging. Plastic is very similar. You can't endlessly reuse PET. At some point, it has to be kind of downcycled into something else because it's no longer the same grade, the same specification as you need it to be, for instance, for food packaging. I realize I've gone super deep into a few questions, but yeah, sorry, go on, Izzy.
Is that not the same for glass? Is recycled glass at a lower grade than virgin glass?
No. So recycled glass has certain other characteristics that change. So the color changes, for instance. And so if you think about, let's say, think about a bottle of whiskey versus a bottle of wine. A bottle of wine tends to be a darker kind of glass, right? Like a green or a dark green, for instance. And in that case, you can actually have quite a lot of recycled content in it because when you recycle glass, it tends to hue. It tends to turn, eventually darker. It kind of goes to maybe flint and then eventually greenish and greener than that. Whereas if you look at like a clear bottle, to maintain the clarity of the bottle, you actually have to have a very high amount of virgin glass material in that. There's a consumer behavior pattern that you'd need to alter, which is you need to be comfortable buying a green bottle of whiskey, for instance, which I think most consumers of whiskey aren't there yet. But if you could get to that, then you could actually just keep reusing the glass.
Yeah. And the one last thing that I want to touch on packaging is that I was speaking to someone from Nestle Waters, and he was saying that to purchase, and Steph, I know you've got some opinions on this, to purchase recycled PET was at a price which he was quoting £1,000 per tonne or something more than what it would be for purchasing virgin. Is this just a spike, an inconsistency, a trend, or is this what we're going to be seeing, going forward for a long time?
So there is definitely a massive demand for good, high quality recycled plastic that can be used in food, for instance. The problem is that this market is very fragmented and gets more fragmented the further into the value chain you go. And so to just give you an example, right, like if you look at the life cycle of recycled plastic, right, like the bottle, let's say, is produced in, and I'm making this up, let's say it's produced in Germany. The bottle gets consumed by someone, like someone drinks the Coca-Cola or whatever it might be in the bottle. The bottle then ends up getting chucked in a best case scenario into a nicely sorted, separated bin. And then that separation is maintained and it goes off towards a sort of a MRF, which is where they kind of separate the materials into different streams. And then it goes off and is kind of granulated and it enters a reuse cycle or recycling cycle. In most other cases globally, that actually doesn't happen. So in most global consumption of plastic, it actually doesn't end up nicely separated and sorted and in its own separate recycling stream. And by most, I mean probably like, I would hazard a guess that probably more than 80% doesn't end up in that nicely, neatly separated at consumption point. Instead, where it ends up in the mixed waste stream, which means that you either have to have more mechanization at the MRF point to separate that into other streams, or more likely some manual process. So I spent a glorious 6 months trawling waste dump sites in Southeast Asia, and actually kind of speaking with waste pickers and sort of scavengers who are picking apart the waste in these markets. And it's literally just, you actually have someone like going out picking out the bottle, and then they strip out the film around the bottle and they take off the cap, and that's separation basically. And then the actual bottle, minus the cap and minus the film, is the PET bottle, which has a ready resale market. To get that from Indonesia into where the person you're speaking with at Nestle Waters is buying it, it goes from Indonesia to a consolidated market, which is likely to be in maybe Singapore or Hong Kong, which is where this stuff then gets picked up by maybe a processor, and then that bottle gets processed into recycled content. So this whole market is super fragmented, which means that to get it to produce predictable volume at the kind of levels where a Nestle Waters would be able to meaningfully purchase it, and predictable quality and predictable standards, that's really, really difficult. And so that's, I think, what ratchets up the price. The way to bring that price down, I think, is to start to get more predictability in content. And I think that actually starts at the disposal point rather than anything after that. Like if you can solve it at disposal, you can reduce the cost later on. If you can't solve it at disposal through proper separation, it's very, very difficult later.
Well, that's our mini silver bullet.
Yes.
Seth, quickly, would love your take on what you thought about the alternative materials and the nutritional sustainable data kind of alignment.
I think that alternative materials is going to be like a massive area of innovation and growth, because there's virtually no end. And obviously there's an end, but like there's virtually no end to just how much you could be doing here. One good example that I've come across is if you look at like alternative dairy inputs, for instance, the feedback that I'm hearing from buyers is that the amounts that they would like to offtake just aren't there yet. And they would actually like to start buying more, but they just can't get enough material or enough predictability again in supply. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg, because speaking with a lot of the innovators, I know that the innovators are looking for big offtake agreements so they can go and raise money and then set up new manufacturing capacity to meet those agreements. But right now, I think the market is just a bit too early, which means that the innovators are still trying to prove credibility. And so the innovation cycle basically works like this, which is I have a great concept, let's say coming out of a PhD thesis or through some practiced industry experience. I have a great concept for an alternative kind of sweetener, let's say. What I need to do is I need to now go and find the R&D team at a big potential customer like a Mondelez or Nestle or a Mars, and I have to convince them that actually this new type of sweetener is the best thing for them since sliced bread or since renewable power, right, to stay in context and on theme. That process is easier or harder depending on how amenable the R&D team is to this sort of initiative. I first need to get through the door, which is hard enough. Once I get through the door, I need to be able to demonstrate that this sweetener meets all of the regular requirements that they have. So for like, let's say, taste profile, quality, purity, anything else that they might be looking for, I also need to demonstrate that it meets the sustainability criteria that would be the differentiating edge for this product. That is quite hard to do without having any money in my pocket to actually develop this proof of concept. Like you actually you need a lab, you need to produce something that is high enough grade that you can pass first time, because you won't get a second shot with most of these R&D teams. So let's say now I'm sitting in Brazil and I've produced this new type of sweetener. The R&D team that I need to engage with is sitting in Zurich. I need to have a lab set up in Brazil that is able to work at this standard. I then need to produce as a good sample. I need to get that sample probably on a plane, get it over to Zurich, get feedback from Zurich on whether this meets the requirements. That process could take me, let's say, 6 months or more to develop my lab product. It could take me another 6 months to get my feedback loop completed with the R&D team in Zurich. So you're already talking about like a massive incubation cycle just before I know if I even have one buyer for my product. Now, if I know that I actually do have a buyer, I now need to say, great, can you give me a $10 million contract so that I can actually go and get some financing to set up the kind of manufacturing facility that I would need to do to fulfill the demand volume that you've asked me for. Because as soon as the R&D team in Zurich says, yes, this is a go, they're not going to say, great, can you send us $100,000 of this? They're going to say, well, to give us $5 million of this, at the end of next calendar year, for instance. So that whole chain then, starts a process for me trying to raise funding. And we can go into that at a later date, but it's not super easy on the back of just one customer. So you need to then go through the whole thing again and again. You have a lot of the conventional challenges of raising money. But let me just pause there, Izzy, because I have bitter wounds in this space as well. So I could go down a rabbit hole here.
That'd be cool in another on another post or another podcast if we actually run through some of the coolest innovators out there alongside the alternative material space. But I want to get on to the U-turn on CSDDD because there's been a lot of talk on the space. For anybody who wasn't aware, this week was a significant blow because the CSDDD, a piece of EU legislation which set mandatory obligations for companies to address the negative impacts on aspects like human rights and the environment, failed to achieve final approval by the European Council. This was actually quite a unique piece because I don't know about you, Steph, but I saw a lot of companies actually coming into this space on LinkedIn saying how upset and how annoyed they were that actually this didn't go through. And for context, this law would have actually required a lot of the largest companies to look into human rights and environmental impact of their policies, and also mandate that they adopt the 1.5 transition plan. So progress on this is now paused until the next EU Parliament post-June. Seth, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to give maybe a somewhat contrarian view here and say that I actually don't think it matters. And the reason I don't think it matters, let me give actually a few reasons. One is because the very fact that the law is on the table and is going to be debated again next year, eventually this law is probably going to come into practice because it's already, frankly, a complementary law to the CSRD. And so the very fact that this law is kind of on the table, has come pretty close to passing, is going to come up again, one time or another, has the largest companies already thinking about how to meet its requirements. And so if you just think about the cogs within the big corporate world, those are already moving in this direction. It's mostly the mid-sized companies that might breathe a sigh of relief here and say, great, one less thing to worry about. So the larger companies, I think, are actually already moving in this space. The second reason why I think the larger companies are already moving in this space is because much of the same territory is covered by the CSRD anyway. You already need to start thinking about your supply chain. You're already start setting public targets for your scope 3. As far as the environmental side goes, most of that is already indicated or kind of prefaced by the CSRD. So a lot of the action that the CSDDD would have boosted is already happening in the large corporate world. This means, so if you accept the fact that the major businesses are, the largest ones are already moving in this direction, then actually a couple of interesting derivatives flow from that. One is that they're probably going to set the tone for the rest of the market. So a big food company will set the tone for a mid-sized food company. The mid-sized company will see what the larger company is doing, and then we'll kind of say, look, we sort of have to compete. If you look at a good example, which is environmental labels on products, you have companies like Oatly, which have been early movers on this, but then you have the big players that have stated commitments to do this in the coming years, like Unilever. And as soon as that happens, in whatever way Unilever does it, it's most likely going to catalyze a shift for its peers, not only in the equivalent sized company space, like the Mondeleses and the Marses, but also in the mid-sized players' space, because they just kind of have to compete with the new playing field. The other derivative is that the suppliers also have to now follow suit, because they need to kind of match the requirements of their larger customers. A lot of what the CSDDD would have catalyzed is change in the supply chain. But if that change in the supply chain is already being pushed because Unilever and Mondelez and Kraft Heinz and Nestle and other big players are starting to require change from their suppliers, then in any case, you're sort of starting to get that halo effect, and you don't need to rely on the CSDDD. I think where the CSDDD is probably, where it is a step back for us not to have it in law, is human rights and some of the social aspects of the value chain, where the CSDDD was quite market leading. At the same time, I think we just have to, as sustainability professionals, we all believe the world is going to end horribly badly. And we're all kind of in the business of shaving off a few degrees of that trajectory. Like, we're all basically in our mind kind of visualizing a curve of some sort of global misery across time, right? One axis is global misery and the other is time. And we're kind of saying, look, this is the trajectory. The area under the curve is a horrible amount of misery and suffering. And the more that we can kind of change the angle of that curve, the better. And so for us, every regulation that gets shelved is a net loss for the world. At the same time, just being at the interface of sustainability and the corporate world and the business community, I feel like there's already so much regulation in the system that we have an overload. The synapses on the business side are being overloaded, and business doesn't know how best to respond. And I think that as sustainability professionals, we need to appreciate that that is a problem for us as well. And the reason is that the more that business gets confused and the more that business gets overloaded, the less business is able to take systematic action. And the degrees on that curve that I talked about are not going to get changed because business has a massive U-turn in the next 2 years. That's not going to happen. It's going to be changed because business starts to address sustainability topics strategically and build systems to address those challenges over decades. And those systems are going to be built because business understands the challenge, translates the challenge into dollars in terms of impact, and has existing systems and structures and teams and KPIs or OKRs within their company transition to enable that shift. And we're starting to see a lot of this as a result of CSRD, but it has already taken 3 years now of CSRD being debated before we're getting there. And even now, most companies don't really understand what they should do about CSRD, actually. Like the 48,000 plus large companies in Europe that are being captured don't actually really understand what to do about this, how to fully meet requirements, what the expectation is. I honestly think it is a bit too soon from just a practical perspective to push more and more, even more ambitious regulation down the tube. And I think that if the risk for us in the sustainability space is that not just that business gets confused and doesn't act, but also that the pushback is that much harder. Like actually, CSRD is now kind of moving in. There isn't that concerted pushback in a big way. Like most companies have started, most larger companies, again, like I said, have started to embrace it. That's great. That's a fantastic win. The last thing you want is a massive blowback at large global scale. It's already happening a bit in the US. You really don't want it to happen in Europe in a bigger way than it is right now. I'd really much rather we get the benefit of existing regulation and start to see that have impact and then raise the playing field, or raise the bar a bit more.
Yeah. Well, speaking about people being overloaded, we're going to have a quick break. And after the break, let's talk about suppliers being overloaded with environmental data asks.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
So I think everybody can relate to a few key challenges, which is your suppliers are overloaded by surveys, which is leading to low response rates. And also there's quite a big variety in supplier maturity in terms of environmental data, which leads to variable data quality that you ultimately can't really trust. I think a lot of things are because of this, but I think particularly in this episode, we want to talk about upskilling procurement and how the procurement team can own this problem and actually really help with this problem. Seth, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, so first of all, I think this is obviously a challenge that most companies are facing. I think that I'm seeing two ways to address this in practice right now. One is where you try and upskill the procurement team and try and get the procurement team to transition. Another is where you set up a new team within the procurement team, like a supply chain sustainability team, and that team has a specific different mandate. And I think that both can work. I generally believe that long term, you want sustainability to be a sort of a horizontal business challenge, which means that it cuts across all functions and teams, and every function and team embraces it as part of the core workload, rather than a kind of vertical challenge where you have it siloed within the company and its own team. I think it's just that sort of problem, very much like the digital transition for business, where you actually need every team to think as a digital native, rather than have a digital team and every team goes to that team for support. And so I do think that the former is probably the long-term trajectory. I think within that, I'm seeing one approach, which is just find a training program that you like. Like, the Cambridge University, for example, has a great executive education suite. And I'm seeing a number of companies send various types of talent into that program, whether it's like the CEO or an MD. I think actually the CEO of Nando's UK was actually part of that program as well. Or, for instance, a procurement lead could be doing that sort of program also. And I think that kind of helps with a bit of the transition. I think when you have a sustainability dedicated supply chain team, that team often comes with the sustainability context, but needs to then understand what are the standard procurement challenges that we're facing. Broadly, I think that whichever way you go about it, I think that we need to solve for 2 or 3 unique types of challenge with the upskilling or the training around this. One is, how do you start blending environmental metrics or sustainability factors into your modeling and your indices for costs? What I mean by that is, right now, let's say if I'm buying, I'm buying glass, let's say bottles for my beverage business, I'm typically going to look at a few criteria. I'm going to look at cost, I'm going to look at quality, timing, quantity. Like, these are the standard typical metrics for me to look at. And on the procurement side, I'm going to know what good looks like. I'm going to have some kind of benchmarking or index or indices, which I'm going to use to make those decisions. And I'm going to have a well-honed playbook and toolkit for how I optimize across those. So I'm going to know exactly which variables I want to give a little room on to maximize other variables. Like, am I happy to give more quantity or more volume to a particular supplier if they can actually demonstrate that they're happy to do this at a lower cost? Let's take some of the best examples, right? Like, one of the best procurement excellence stories in the world of the last couple of decades is Apple. And if you look at how Apple managed its procurement transition, they basically identified a few key suppliers, like Foxconn, for instance, to be their manufacturing partners for the iPhone and other products. And then they said, we're going to give like huge amounts of volume to these partners. Like, these partners are going to become the largest businesses in their home countries just by the sheer amount of volume that we're going to give. But in return, we're going to have really demanding standards on quality, and we're going to really, really squeeze them on margin. And so there's going to be very little left on the table for them, and they're going to do exactly what we want them to do on timing as well. And so famously, the way that Apple minimizes its inventories, they literally draw a line across the factory floor, and they say if the material is on that side of the line, it belongs to the suppliers. And once our engineer or our technician goes and crosses the line and picks it up and takes it over, it now belongs to us. And that's how they get inventory time down to literally like minutes, I think. And so if you kind of look at this playbook right now really leaves very little room for sustainability. You sort of have to think about sustainability as a qualitative criteria. And so what procurement teams are doing right now is they're sort of thinking of it as an add-on. So like, if you look at BT, for instance, BT has ESG, the telecom company has ESG criteria as part of its procurement process. But my understanding is that the ESG criteria are an add-on. They're like a sort of a filter, basically, or a base case threshold, or they're kind of brownie points. There's something added on to differentiate suppliers. They're not blended into the core variables that the procurement team is optimizing for. And so I think that the procurement team, if it wants to bring in sustainability into the core variables, it has to either think, can I blend in, for instance, carbon with cost? And can I say that a kilo or 100 kilos of carbon has a price of X in my business, and therefore I can actually blend that in with the cost of the product, because actually what I'm buying is not just material worth $100, it comes with a liability of $20. Because I'm buying a product, I'm buying glass bottles worth $100, but I'm also actually taking carbon onto my inventory, and the carbon has a cost of $20 based on what my carbon pricing formula is in my business. So net, I'm actually kind of getting, I'm actually getting $120 because I'm paying the $100 and I have a liability of $20, which I now need to take care of somehow. Just as an example. And so that's kind of one way to think about it. The other way is to make it a hard quality criteria, where you say, for instance, in the same way that you must comply with my material specifications, you must supply me products that have, let's say, produced with renewable power. And that's just a hard quality requirement. And if you don't meet that requirement, I'm not buying anything from you at any price, which is, again, very similar to how you would manage a quality constraint. So that's kind of a couple of ways to build it into procurement practices.
And getting procurement on board to do this, especially if this is, a new initiative, you might be a new sustainability practitioner, you've just come into the company, you're trying to identify the right people, get the CPO on board to, put forward the request. Do you have any advice in terms of things that have worked, maybe like financial incentives, career incentives? What's your take?
I would actually go with something simpler. And I would say that I think that procurement teams are the best procurement teams are a fantastic engine or machine for the business. They run predictably. They do what they need to do. They manage to get product into the business or throughput into the business on time, at cost, at quality, at volume. And you can start tinkering with that, and you can start to kind of, you can basically adopt two approaches, right? Either you say, look, I need the procurement team now not to think in a linear way, which is let's maximize these variables, but I need them to think laterally, which means that I need every sort of procurement leader or procurement professional to be a creative problem solver. And I need them to lean in and understand, well, actually, I'm buying dairy products. How do I actually figure out and work with the provider and supplier to decarbonize what's happening at the supplier, and maybe even multiple tiers behind? And I think that can potentially work. The risk is that you distract that engine that is so good at operating in a linear fashion and delivering what the business needs of it. And so I think that potentially you want to start thinking about that at a leadership level, but I don't think you necessarily want to distract all the sort of procurement professionals within the machine and kind of force them to think laterally. I think actually a better way to do it is to figure out what are the tools that help those procurement professionals to work sustainability into their business as usual. So again, think of a good carbon pricing mechanism that can really help. Think of a hard quality constraint that can really help. Think of good tooling that can go alongside the product. So how can the buyer say, actually, by the way, we have some software that our company is using, and our company would like to give you a license to use this software as well, and we're covering all the costs of this, and this software will measure your carbon emissions baseline, for instance, and we believe this is a value of X thousand dollars that we're giving you. Buying teams understand that because they're used to putting kind of tricks and candy on the table to entice sellers and say, look, what an amazing partner we are for your business. We're actually giving back as well. Again, go back to the Apple example. One of the big reasons why every third-party manufacturer in China was so excited to work with Apple, despite the razor-thin margins, was because they knew that by working with Apple, they will get upskilled and they will understand the cutting edge of technology and they'll be able to market that to others. And so if buying teams know that there's stuff that they can also give back and put on the table as value-added services on their side that they're giving into the suppliers, actually that's something that they can understand and work with. And so maybe it's software, maybe it's again some form of incentive or R&D budget or R&D support. It's co-investment for some initiatives, but you then want to start ring fencing. What do those things go towards? Like if you're co-investing in interventions, don't think about a whole panoply of 100 different types of interventions. Think of like 3-4 silver bullets. Like our business, buying from your business, is happy to invest in renewable power in these locations at this price to help decarbonize the material that you're selling us. If you can prove a business case that meets these specifications as validated by our decision-making criteria. If you make it very simple and work it into the existing procurement playbook in the business, it'll go that much further.
As we've mentioned before, you tend to have thousands of suppliers. So being able to figure out your internal carbon price to then get the environmental data from that supplier to actually assess whether, a green premium is worthy in this case is a lot. So what's your take on how to actually go around cohorting these suppliers to find which ones are the ones to invest meaningful time and money in to get this data?
Yeah, I think the fundamental truth, and I think Mars is very good at this, is you don't need to care about most of your suppliers in a big way. Because most of the suppliers, just by volume, and I'm meaning this from a sustainability perspective, but just if you think about the, let's say, emissions or even water intensity contribution of most of your suppliers by number, like you have 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 suppliers, the majority of those are not very material suppliers for you. Like you're a small part of their business potentially, they're a small part of your business. Their actual contribution is not hugely significant. Within your supplier cohort, I think you actually want to start cohorting based on a few criteria. I would look at probably 3 criteria to begin with. One is I would look at the material at play. So is this intrinsically a high emissions material Or if you're looking at water, is this a high water intensity material that I'm buying? And so, if you think about dairy, pulp and paper in the packaging space, any kind of packaging more or less, sugar, right? Like there's a bunch of things you can think of. You can probably make a list of 20 or 30, and they will probably be true for most large companies, I think. The second filter I would look at is this a material supplier for us on a volume basis? So they are in a high material input category, and they're a large volume supplier. That's probably already going to start defining your cohort. You may also have some suppliers that are not intrinsically in a high emissions material business, but are such a high volume supplier of your company that the numbers just add up. And so there might be a lot of good overlap between those two filters, but there might also be some outliers where actually the material skews a small supplier upwards, or the volume skews a low intensity material upwards. So those two are first two filters. The third one I would think about is what is a material input that is uniquely associated with my business, like that a customer of mine would intrinsically think of associated with my business, and that's probably going to be a subset of the first two. And so, let's say I'm in the snack food business and I'm selling chocolates and candy and all that sort of stuff, right? Like sugar is probably an intrinsic material that like the consumer is going to think of my business. If I'm selling anything that it looks like chocolate, cocoa is going to be one of those materials. Anything that looks like coffee, right? Coffee is going to be one of those materials. It's not rocket science. And I think that already starts to give you your first cohort. I would probably look to sort of describe suppliers across a grid. And so in the grid, you maybe have one axis, which is what are the material inputs, for instance, and another axis might be location or geography, or more likely maturity. You may actually find, for instance, that a dairy processor that you're working with in the Netherlands or in the UK, it actually has a lot more in common with a dairy processor in India, a large mature dairy processor in India, than with another dairy processor in the same geography. And that's just because that dairy processor in India thinks and operates and works to the same standard as the market leaders in their category globally, because they're just punching that much above their weight in their location. Versus, let's say, the 20th dairy supplier or dairy processor in the UK, which actually maybe has much more modest ambitions. Textiles is, again, a great example, right? If you think about a company that I know called Interloop, which is one of the largest sock makers in the world. Interloop is ostensibly a Pakistan-based company, and I think they're listed in Pakistan. But if you actually look at where Interloop operates, they operate in the US, they operate in Bangladesh, they operate in Pakistan, I think they operate in Sri Lanka. They're in many different countries of the world, and they have manufacturing sites across these locations. So they actually would probably think and work a lot more like a much more sophisticated manufacturer would in Europe or the US, and would be more comparable with that cohort. So that's a little of how I would think about also crossing geographic boundaries.
Yeah. I quite like the quantitative side and the qualitative side. Like the quantitative, as you said, the volume, the spend, like materiality. And then on the qualitative side, those like fuzzier feelings, the relationship, their maturity. I think that's also quite a good like polarization of how to look at it. Just to note to everyone, we're actually hosting a webinar on supplier engagement with Seth and the amazing Ilya, who heads up the kind of value chain engagement stuff at Altruistic. So we'll drop a link in the show notes below. So please register interest there. And we're also doing a guide on this because we've realized that a lot of people want to know more. So stay tuned. Seth, thank you for sharing all those pearls of wisdom. It was great to see you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at the offsite, back in person.
Me too. Me too, Izzy. Looking forward to it. Thanks for a great show, and I think this new format works quite nicely for us.
Yeah, to all the listeners, we're actually going to do this on a weekly basis from now on.
Putting a stake in the ground, Izzy. Yeah. Putting a stake in the ground.
Seth, you better make space in your diary. It's now confirmed. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Seth.
Thanks.
Bye.